Welcome to the Immigrant Entrepreneurs Podcast, episode 74. My name is Alina Warwick, and today we have Kam Knight on the show. But before we continue with this episode, if you are listening to the show and it brings you value, please share some love by subscribing and leaving a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It was hectic. I come from a poor part of a third world country. So there was a lot of poverty where I grew up and a lot of danger and a lot of inequality. And I also remember there being like turf wars in like the neighborhood or the town I was in.
Cam's parents are from India, but Cam was born in Dubai. Growing up, he had tremendous difficulty focusing, sitting still, and keeping his mind on his thoughts and his thoughts on his mind. His mind and emotions raced and flew all over the place in quick, intense, and uncontrolled succession. This kept him from performing well in school and affected every area of his personal, professional, and academic life. He became a certified public accountant in the States, but when he was doing some research about successful people, he found that a majority of them were entrepreneurs. So he went on a journey to travel to 100 different countries and suddenly found an urge to write, something that he was never good at or even enjoyed writing. Remember, Cam is an immigrant, and up until that point in his life, he didn't care to write and didn't have any strong desire. But to his surprise, when he picked up writing, he became so good at it. Cam is now a coach, writer, and an author of several best-selling books in the area of mental performance, such as memory, concentration, and productivity. I learned so much from talking to Cam, so let's dive right in and hear all about his journey. All right, Cam, thank you so much for coming on the Immigrant Entrepreneurs Podcast. I truly appreciate your time, and I'm so excited to hear all about your journey. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So, let's talk about your immigrant journey. Tell us where you're from and when did you come to the United States?
All right. Well, my parents are from India, and I moved to the States when I was young, the summer before second grade. So, quite a while ago, back in the 80s.
Okay. And so, do you remember what it was like growing up in India?
I definitely do remember what it was like growing up in Asia. It was hectic. I come from a poor part of a third world country. So there was a lot of poverty where I grew up and a lot of danger and a lot of inequality. And I also remember there being like turf wars in like the neighborhood or the town I was in. And I don't quite remember the details, but I just remember there were like random days where you shouldn't be out as there was going to be some sort of fighting going on. So we stayed indoors and the streets would be completely empty. And also, I grew up in a place where all the homes had metal bars on the windows and jagged glass on
Wow.
the roof lights to prevent intruders. But at the same time, it was also fun. And what I mean by that is like I found that in developing nations, like the care and attention for kids and children is not like in developed nations. So we tended to have a lot of freedom. It was like the Little Rascals, if you remember that TV shows.
Yeah.
We running around causing trouble. In the evenings, it was especially fun because every evening, and I mean every evening, all the kids would go up on the roof of their house and fly kites. So
Wow.
the sky would be full of kites, and there would be battle between kites. Some people use like a sharp thread to cut the thread of other kites, or if someone was skilled, they could wrap their kite around another person's and pull it down and take it from them. And then at night, it got even better, at least for me. That's because most homes where I lived, there was a part that didn't have a roof. So my mom and my brothers and sisters would lay on cots at night and watch the stars. And it was amazing and incredible. Never have I seen the night sky quite like how I remember it when I was a kid.
Wow. That's so amazing. I've never heard of such an amazing childhood experience, especially flying kites on the rooftops. I could imagine all the colorful kites going up in the sky as you're walking through. So that is so, so cool. So, what was that journey like for your parents to leave India and come to the States?
Yeah, the journey was kind of interesting. The way it happened is my dad came first. So he moved to America and to get himself settled before he brought us over. So he was gone for 2 years of, my early
3 years?
childhood. 2 years.
2 years. Okay.
Yeah. He was gone for 2 years of my early childhood while my mom and my brothers and sisters, we were in Asia on our own, kind of doing our own thing, kind of like with the description I had described. And then about 2 years later, my dad came and he brought us all to the States. And I actually remember the first day we were in our new home. It was just so surreal because homes where I'm from, they weren't nice and they're kind of run down. And, I kind of described a little bit of how they are. But
Mhm.
in the States, we moved to a suburb of a nice town, and I don't know, it was just like a very different experience, just getting used to a completely different land.
And did your parents know any family or friends in the States before they moved, or how did they get a visa to come out here?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that my uncle, he was a very successful cardiologist, very hardworking, very intelligent. In fact, when I had met people who had known my uncle, they would always say the same thing about him, how he was an extremely intelligent person. And I remember when I was a kid, we would go to his house to visit. And, he had pictures of him shaking hands with every president since like Reagan. So he did
Wow.
well for himself, obviously. Yeah.
Mhm.
And, he brought all his brothers and sisters over to the States. And my dad was his brother. And, he brought him over. And then from there, my dad brought us over. So I was really fortunate that my uncle was a hardworking person where America allowed him to come and he became successful enough for him to bring everybody else.
So tell me, what kind of jobs did your parents pick up when they first immigrated?
Well, my dad was initially just working at a motel, not a very lucrative or sexy or high paying job. And he worked at nights, which kind of made it a challenge because during the days he needed to sleep and rest. And, as
Mhm.
kids, being kids, we were kind of rowdy and there was always a little bit of conflict there. But then later on, he moved on to getting into real estate. My mom, she ended up staying as, what's a polite way of saying it? She was a homemaker. So
Oh,
she
a stay-at-home
didn't,
mom? Mhm.
yeah, she was a stay at home mom. She didn't end up getting a job or doing something only because, the part of the world that I come from is so culturally different. In fact, I have a great story to share about this. About 10
Yes.
years ago, I was in Colombia and I was chatting with an English traveler I had met. And he was telling me how he loved India, the food, the people, the culture, and everything else about it. And he commented about an observation that he had made from his experience of India. And he said that throughout history and even with colonialism, India never conformed to the outside world. It always
Mm.
made the outside world conform to it. And I feel
Mm.
that is a very accurate description of India and the people. So I grew up with parents that they came from a culture that they were like set in their ways. And when they moved
Mhm.
to America, they didn't really try hard to integrate with the American culture. They were just, set in their
Mhm.
ways. And
Mhm.
so, my mom stayed very traditional. She still wore saris all the way until she passed away. And even if she wanted to get a job or make a career, like it was too much of a culture shock for her and she never really adjusted.
Mhm. And I think it's very common amongst immigrants. I don't think it's just people coming from India. I think it's a lot of people from Asian countries and European countries where when they grew up in that culture and that environment, they come to America. And that's also a beauty to have America being portrayed amongst all these different cultures and different tactics that people can bring from different cultures and their heritage. And that's also another, positive ways, but I can totally relate. I don't think that it's only just your family or your parents. I think it's very common amongst immigrants, especially immigrant parents. So tell me, what were some of the struggles that you had to go through when you first came to United States? You were very young, and did you come across any racism, any bullying when you were in school?
Yeah, yeah. So there, I definitely had my fair share of struggles. I would say I had two main struggles, and one of them came from what I just described. My parents kind of coming here and not really integrating with the culture was very difficult for me. So I never really developed an understanding of the customs and traditions here in the States and the way to act and interact with each other. And that
Mhm.
really affected me. That affected me when interacting with peers, teachers, bosses, and really the real world at large. I never really got it until I got much older and I kind of almost had to learn it. One of the biggest struggles I had was my beliefs. As I mentioned, I come from a poor part of a very poor country. And then I moved to a well off suburb of a very rich country. So the contrast was huge. The lifestyle in this country was very different, and I looked very different from the people here. So, for one reason or another, I grew up with a very limiting mindset. For much of my childhood and much of my young adult life, my mind made it seem like I wasn't allowed here. Like nobody wanted me here and everybody knew it. And above all, I knew it as well.
Hmm.
And there's a certain degree of racism and prejudice I experience. And pretty much it's everywhere. Like even in India, there's racism. It wasn't anywhere near the extent that my mind made it seem. And it felt so real that I behaved and acted as if it was real. So that was a real challenge, like being in a completely foreign land and looking different. And my mind making me think that I was not good enough and not worthy. That felt so real that I acted that way to the point where people just treated me that way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, I get that. When my parents would drop us off at school, we would wear these ugly fugly bows on our heads.
Okay.
And my sister and I would get bullied all the time by little
Yeah.
kids. Of course, the teachers adored him, but all the kids would try to rip him out of my hair. And, like I felt unwanted, like you said. And as growing up here, I just felt so ashamed of myself in a way where
Yes.
I don't fit in, and why am I the weird one? Why am I an outcast?
But let me ask you a question. Like, when you felt weird, was it because the children made you feel weird, or did you feel weird
Yes.
because it was something projection of yourself?
It was probably both. It was probably both. I know for sure when we were dropped off, we didn't know any English. So we spoke
Yeah.
Russian in the house fluently. So that was a huge barrier, probably like yourself as well. And then also, all the kids practically like just ran away from me, like, oh, this
Really? Okay.
weird person in this classroom, and what's on her head, and why is this so big and ugly. So.
Okay. I say, I'll be honest, like my experience, like I did have the bullying and I did have like not fitting in, but I felt
Mhm,
like for me, when I look back at it, it wasn't that the kids I was around, fortunately, were picking on me or were choosing
mhm.
to act that way. It was just that my self-esteem was so low that I almost not forced, but I almost made them respond that way to me, if that makes any sense.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cam. I want to go back to, you said you grew up in a poor country, in the poorest of the poor country.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So I've traveled quite a bit. Yeah, I've traveled to nearly 100 countries now in my life.
Wow.
Yeah, and I've seen pretty much all the gamut. And I would say India is probably one of the poorest countries I've ever been to. And there's a part of India that is known to be the ghetto or the poor of India. And that's really where I'm from. And I mean, the last time I visited was a while ago, but it was just really depressing to see after growing up in the States and going back there to see that, wow, like there's a part of reality that lives in conditions that are just so poor and so awful. I mean, it's kind of hard to really describe.
So are we talking about, I mean, there's still running water, still running electricity, or there was very limited of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's still running water and there's still electricity, but there's just so many people, so much poverty, a lot of homeless on the streets, so much like filth. Like, I remember when I visited a place where my parents are from, I was like eating a banana. I'm like, "Hey, where can I throw this?" And my aunt was like,
On the
"The
ground?
the city is your garbage." And it literally was. It was just filthy. You know, India is known for having cows kind of roaming on the streets because certain religions, the cow is sacred over there.
Right.
And every cow on the street was so malnutritioned that they would just like stand in the middle of the street with running traffic, and it looked like they just wanted to be hit and put out of their misery. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
There's just
Wow.
like dogs everywhere doing each other, and it was just a really filthy place.
Were your daily needs constantly met? Food, shelter, or did you go through days where you had no idea where the food was going to come from?
You know, luckily my daily needs were met, the basic needs of like shelter,
Okay. Mhm.
food, and even schooling. Like we did have school. But what's really interesting is where I come from, teachers can hit you. You know, like if you're not behaving well, they'll come by you or they'll have the whole class hold out their hand and they will smack it with a large ruler. It was kind of like that. And the classrooms were really packed. So it wasn't like here in the States where you would have 20 to 30 people in a class. It was more like 40 to 50 people in a class, maybe even more. We didn't
Mhm.
have our own desks. It was just like those flat tables, and you would have 3 to 4 people in each table. All like the nice and luxuries that we are kind of used to in in school here, it just didn't
Mhm.
exist. In fact, when I moved to America, and you know, you'd have arts and crafts and construction paper and glue, and you make all these things and all these projects from second, third, and fourth grade, and it's like it was all free and I'm just like, this is crazy. This is amazing. Like how much kids have here, whereas over there, we barely even had books to work off of.
So, Cam, before you tell our listeners about Mind Lily, tell us a little bit about the path you took. And I want to know if you tried to go into any other fields before starting your business.
Yeah, sure. I pretty much tried everything, and I mean everything. Like coming from the part of the world I come from, there's actually a strong respect for and pressure for education. So initially, my goal was to go to an Ivy League school. And although I worked hard in school, I didn't make the grades to get into an Ivy League. I did end up going to a decent business college and getting a degree in accounting and finance. And then once I graduated, I got my CPA and did accounting for a few years. But accounting wasn't, I guess, challenging enough. So I also started doing computer programming. But the corporate world wasn't for me. You know, I just didn't have the social skills for the corporate world. Remember, I was talking about how I didn't really integrate into the culture really well. I didn't really
Hmm.
understand the nuances of how to interact and things like that.
Hmm.
And, you know, that's really important once you get into the business world. You know, while you're in school, you can kind of get away without having good, you know, social skills, especially skills for a job in positions like accounting and computer programming. So although I was very good at what I did, I would toot my own horn and say I was actually fairly excellent. It's just that I didn't know how to talk and interact with managers and other people to be able to get the raises or the income I deserved. And I always kind of blamed it on corporate politics and my managers and this and that. But, when it came down to it, it was my own fault. Like, I just wasn't, I would say, I don't want to say I wasn't a good employee. I was a good, hardworking employee, but socially, I lacked in that department. So that limited
Mhm.
me. But I didn't realize it was that. I thought it was corporate America. So then I started thinking about doing things on my own. I started to realize doing my own thing was a golden road because when I look at the ultra successful, there were always people who owned their own business. So I began dipping my hands into real estate, but that was right before the real estate bubble burst. So nothing came of it either. And then my friend and I decided to go into patent, and nothing came of that either. Then at
Wow.
a certain point in my life, I had an itch to write. It was an overpowering itch, one I couldn't resist. And it's
Hmm.
funny because I don't know where this itch came from because I was never a writer or like writing. And being an
Mhm.
immigrant, I kind of sucked at writing in the English language. So
Mhm.
I had no business writing, but as I mentioned, it was an overpowering itch that I followed. And here I am about 10 years later, having written and published nearly a dozen books.
Wow. And so when you said you went into accounting, did you go to college and get an accounting degree?
Yeah, I got a finance and accounting degree at the time.
Okay, and so when you were studying these super successful people, you saw a consistency that they all had businesses. So while working at 9 to 5 job, you kind of just gravitated to doing something on your own. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, more or less, because I was doing a 9 to 5 job. And although being in office job, especially doing accounting, it was decent money. But being human, once we reach a certain level, we realize there's a more level, there's a higher level. And so I kind of started seeing that like the really successful people, like financially successful, they had their business or they're doing their own thing. They weren't the ones who put in the grind and went through a 4 year degree or got a 4 year degree at a college and then worked with that degree, whether it was in computer science or whatnot. And sure, they were doing well, but the ones who were doing extremely well, I found necessarily didn't even go to college or even high school. In fact, I remember when I was in college and we were learning in my finance class, a lot of our case studies that we were studying about, successful companies, they were like a lot of them were started by people who didn't have a 4 year degree. And I'm not trying to
Mhm.
knock college degree. I think it's
Right.
really important if you want to go that route.
Right.
But there's something to be said about starting your own business because the upside potential is almost limitless.
Yes, absolutely. So, so powerful. Thank you so much for enlightening us. And I always say on this show that you really, immigrants, really do not need to get licenses and degrees and courses under your belt to start a new business. Of course, if you're doing CPA work, you're going to need to be licensed. Or if you're a lawyer, of course, you need to be licensed in that field. But other than that, like you mentioned, a lot of these super successful people, they don't even have a college education. And there's
Yeah.
so many people on my show that come on and just say, I'm either a college dropout and I'm making millions, or I never went to college because that's not my thing. So it's so, so enlightening to hear that. And that just proves to our immigrant entrepreneurs that, hey, you can do it
Yeah.
without all of these licenses and highly educational degrees. So,
Yeah. In fact, what's kind of ironic is in college, I was learning about people who didn't go to college to make their success. Kind of funny, right?
that is ironic, right?
Yeah, like I'm serious. Like you would go through different case studies of companies that did well, or founders of companies, or
Hmm.
people who reach a success. And it was really interesting the pattern of how many of them didn't go to college, dropped out of college, or some of them didn't even complete high school.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
again, I do want to say that there's nothing wrong with college or a 4 year education,
right.
especially if somebody wants to go into a field like accounting, which requires a college degree and certain certifications. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, it's important to realize that is not necessary if you want to have financial success and freedom.
All right, Cam. So let's talk about your books. You have a whole bunch that you've written. Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about maybe the most recent books or whatever book that comes to mind. Tell us a little bit about that. And what are some of the topics that you're writing about?
Yeah, so I kind of veered into two main kind of topics. One is self-help slash personal development. So early
Okay.
on, I really got into certain self-help techniques like self-talk and visualization and goal setting, the kind of standard stuff that gets talked about. But at the time, I felt like, well, let me backtrack. At the time, there were no podcasts or YouTube channels or self-publishing. So a majority of the personal development content came from big names. And because they came from big names, they were geared for a mainstream audience. And because they were geared for a mainstream audience, they tended to be very simple and stayed very surface level. And I felt like the techniques I had learned were really effective and useful, but it could have been described and communicated better because I had to figure out how to make it work for me. I had to really like dig deep into it on my own to make it work. So that's why I started getting into writing in the beginning with those topics, is because I felt like there was a gap in the industry that I wanted to fill. And then later on, I really got into the mind and mental performance. So then I wrote books on memory, speed reading, concentration, mind mapping, things that are really effective to not only learn, but remember, retain, and use information at a high level. And again, the reason I started writing about that is because I felt like there was a gap in the industry. Majority of the content and books were pretty much just rehashing the same stuff that had been talked about for decades, even 100 years. And there wasn't anything new being brought into it. And anytime I put something out, I feel like I need to bring something new. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. Like, why rewrite something someone else has already written? So when we look at my books, it's very novel. In fact, I get a lot of praise from my readers, especially reviews on Amazon, in the novelty that I bring into a specific topic.
So, give us some tips on speed reading, concentration, or
Memory.
enhancing our memory capacity. What are some tips that you can share with our listeners?
All right. So, one of the best advice I can give people is related to memory. And I want people to understand not to rely on their natural mental processes to remember information. That's because as humans, we forget up to 80% of what we hear, see, and learn within a few hours of hearing, seeing, and learning it. So that's not within the first few months, weeks, or even days, but the first few hours.
Mhm.
What's interesting is that we rely on our memory to remember much more than that. We will come across a great idea, important instruction, valuable advice, or a painfully obvious fact and think that it's just too great, too important, too valuable, and too obvious to forget. And sure enough, we'll forget. Then we do it again. We'll come across an even greater idea, more important instruction, even more valuable advice, or painfully obvious fact, and think that this time it's even more great, important, and valuable to forget. And then we forget again. And what's interesting is that we don't just forget the thought or idea, but we forget that we had one in the first place. We forget that we forgot. It's simply gone. It's as if we never
Mm.
came across that thought or idea. And what's sad is many of us actually live our lives like this, constantly forgetting important and crucial information coming our way. And what I want people to understand is much of the advice or solutions that they're seeking, they've already come across like plenty of times. It's just that they forgot that they did. And even you and I, doing this podcast, we will forget majority of what we talked about and the content in it. And in a long enough timeline, we'll forget that we even did this podcast. And it's not a matter of if, but when. And that
Mm.
when is usually sooner than later. And unless we do something to act on the information that we're learning, whether that's to doing something to remember it or doing something to take action on, it'll be lost and forgotten very quickly. So if there was one like really important piece of advice I want to give your listeners is to know that just because something sounds amazing or something's going to be helpful doesn't mean that you will remember it. And it's really important that if you want to remember it, to do something to be able to remember it or to take action on it right away so it starts being integrated into your mind and body.
So, what are some ways we can improve that particular piece? If we come across a thought that is so crucial, should we be writing those things down? Should we be turning it into action immediately? Or what are some things that we can incorporate in our daily lives?
Yeah, there are many things that we can do. If it's something that we're learning, then we want to repeat that information in one way or another.
Okay.
And repetition, you know, it's one of those things that we heard from childhood. And because we heard it since childhood, we think it's not going to be useful or important for us. But I just want to stress how important repetition is. You know, anytime a memory is formed, grooves or tracks are created in the brain. And you can think of these grooves or tracks like footprints or breadcrumbs that lead to a specific memory. So the more that a thought, idea, or fact is repeated, the deeper those grooves or tracks of that memory get, making it easier for the mind to find that piece of information. Now, it's really important that to understand that those grooves or tracks are not made deeper by how important or valuable the information is. It is made deeper solely through the act of repetition. And this is a reason
Mm,
why radio and television jingles are so hard to get out of our head. But something important like a meeting can be forgotten at the drop of the hat. The jingle has
mhm.
been repeated so much, it gets locked in our mind. But because we thought the meeting was important, we didn't do anything to reinforce that memory, so it gets forgotten. So we can remember something without having any intention if it is repeated. But we can forget something even though we have the full intention and desire to remember it if it's not repeated. So if we can repeat what we're learning, we're going to have a better time and chances of remembering it. And repetition can be done many ways. You know, it's like if I hear some advice, I can just repeat it back to the person. And just the act of repeating it back triggers the neurons in the brain to fire the neurons a certain way, which reinforces memory. We can write it down. And then once it's written down, we make sure to review it so it stays on top of our mind. And most importantly, the best way to retain something is to take action on it. It is said that we remember as much as 90% of what we do versus what we see or hear, which has less retention rate. So when we get valuable information, let's say while we're listening to this podcast, it's really important that we take notes. And then after the podcast is over, to review those notes. And then and later on, try to recall what we had learned so it stays on top of our mind. But then more importantly, make sure we take action because the sooner we can take action, the sooner we can really start reinforcing not just the memory of it, but the application of the advice.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know when I write things down, I have journals all over my office and I'm constantly journaling and writing things down. That's another sense of remembering things. I don't know if you can tell me, is that a trigger that is formed in our brains when we're physically writing things down that we will just constantly remember things better? Because I know for sure it's not writing it or typing it in laptop or a mobile device, I'm not going to remember that. But if I'm writing things down, like you said, going through a podcast or an audio book or reading through a book, I'm journaling and I'm writing things down as I go on. Because otherwise, like you said, I'm going to forget what
Yeah.
I read and I'm going to have to read the whole book all over again to try to get something out of it. So, what about writing things down? Does that help?
Yes, it is extremely effective in not only helping us understand information better, but also to remember information better. In fact, studies show that people who take notes remember the information better than people who don't take notes, even if they never look at those notes again. So this is really important to understand. If you're
Yeah.
taking notes, you're going to remember what you're learning better, even if you never look at those notes again. That's why I always have a pen in hand with a notebook by my side taking notes. Like as we're talking, I'll still write things down because it'll help me pay attention. And although I'll never look at, not that I'll never, but I'll likely not look at our conversation again, I'll better
Mhm.
remember it. And there's many reasons for why that is, but one of the most important reason is that writing is an extremely complex and complicated activity or task. There's no other species that can write the way we do. And not only can no other species do it, but when we learned to do it, it didn't come easy. Although it seems like writing is simple, when we go back to our childhood, we'll realize that it actually took years to learn how to write. We first
Mhm.
started forming letters and then combining letters to form words and then combining words to form sentences. And then after doing it enough, it became a lot more easier and fluid. And so
Mhm.
that complex process pretty much, and when we're writing notes, we're writing it directly into our brain. It kind of implants it into our head because of that complex movement of our hand. It transfers to our brain in a way where, like I said, it just kind of plants information in our brain.
So tell me a little bit about speed reading. You have a book, Learn to Read a 200 plus page book in 1 hour.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. If I can do that, I'd be reading like 100 books a month. How is it possible that people can speed read? I know it's a method. I know people have learned how to master this technique, but what are some secrets behind it?
Okay. So I'm glad you repeated the title. It's actually one of my best-selling books. It's hit the bestseller status in the US, in Canada, and UK.
Nice.
Yeah, so
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. And one of the most effective ways to improve reading speed is to not look at words, but to look at the spaces in between words.
What?
I know it sounds crazy, but
What?
it took me a while to figure this out. And I'm going to try to explain why it works that way. So, for the people who are listening to this podcast, what I'd like you to do is look up at wherever they're at. So, if
Mhm.
they're sitting in front of a desk, like look at everything around them, the table, the chairs, the phone on the table, the pens, and the paper. Or if they're somewhere else, notice what's around them. If they're in like a living room, notice the painting on the wall, the carpet on the floor, and everything else. And notice how quickly your mind is able to process that. Like you move your eyes in a direction and it can simultaneously see and understand what is taking in. Your mind isn't going, well, this thing over here has four legs and a flat top, so it must be a table. And the thing next to it is four legs, a flat top, and a backrest, so it's a chair. No, it's instantaneous. So I wondered, why can't we do that with text? And
Hmm.
so I started like experimenting with reading, written text in all sorts of different ways, like looking at the top of words or just the bottom of words or the sides. And I went out and researched how the eyes work and operate and all of that. And what I realized is that when we look at a word, our eyes focus in on that word. So we can't see everything around it. It gets focused in. But when you look at the space in between words, my eyes don't focus in, so we can see the words to the left and right. And one of the most effective ways, it works for many people, it doesn't work for everybody, is to look at every like look at the space between every 3 to 4 words and just skip from one space to another. And if you do it in rapid sequence, your mind will pick up the word and the meaning simultaneously without this intermediary step to like go word for word trying to understand what the meaning is. So if you have
Mm.
something in front of you, just look
Yes, I
at,
do.
okay, so open it,
I got a
look
book
at,
open. I'm trying this right now.
yeah. So look at the spaces between every 3 to 4 words and just go from one space to another.
Wow, I did not realize that we can do this. And it probably comes naturally because, I mean, you just explained it. And just thinking about not reading the word, but every 2 to 3 words and the spaces in between, because clearly we can see a lot of words when looking at one thing.
Don't
Yeah, go
don't
ahead.
look at the 2 to 3 words.
The
Pick
spaces.
yeah, the spaces between every 2 to 3 words.
Hmm.
So, like the first sentence, look at the space like 3 words in, and then jump to a space 3 words after, and jump to another space, and just hop from one space to another. I'm not describing it well verbally. It's much easier when you read my book and you see how it's done.
No, no, I totally get it. You're such a very deep philosopher with so much power and wisdom. And no, I totally appreciate just the tidbit information that you provided to our listeners and myself. But real quick, I wanted to go back to your accounting journey. You
Yeah.
mentioned that you quit and you wanted to do something on the side, and you started one thing, you got into patents. Did you have any savings when you decided to quit, or did you start a side hustle while you were doing your accounting 9 to 5 job?
Yeah, so I did both. I never really quit my job until I felt secure enough, financially secure. I always had savings before I even decided to jump into doing something on my own.
Mhm.
And when I did decide to do something on my own, I did it as a side hustle in the beginning, just to kind of get my foot on the ground and see if there was something worthwhile there. I think it's really important to have some sort of a cushion. I always tell people who are looking into entrepreneurship to have like a 6 month cushion where if things fall apart or things aren't going well, that you can rely on. And what's really interesting about having that cushion is like it saves you from so much stress and agony. Because when there's no money and you can't pay the bill and you got to make sure you have to earn enough money this month to cover expenses, you go into scarcity mode. And there's
Mhm.
something about when you're in scarcity mode or when you're hungry that people don't trust you and they don't want to hire you and they don't want to give you what you want.
Mhm.
And when you can feel calm and not stressed by financial pressure, then you're able to think better and you're not exuding this need where I gotta have this client or I gotta get this acceptance on this. And
Mhm.
there isn't this, what's the word? Can't think of the word right now, but there isn't this like you can think more freely, you can plan, you can make bigger plans and things like that. And I can't
Mhm.
tell you how much this has helped me, especially as a writer, because there are some moments where for one reason or another my book sales aren't doing as well.
Mhm.
And I don't go into panic mode because I know I have a cushion and I have got 6 months to write it out. And you know what?
Mhm.
Usually it takes a few months to write it out. But because I have that cushion, I don't stress out about it. I know that I've got some time if something doesn't go well. So I
Yeah.
really highly recommend people, whatever they have to do, to create some sort of a cushion because it'll make the journey so much easier. It'll take one element out of, there's so many things that can stress us out, but there's one
Mhm.
big element that can take out so we can just be a lot more relaxed when we're starting and growing our business.
I love it. So, Cam, did you have any mentors that helped you out to start any of your ventures, or the most recent one with Mind Lily?
Ah, that's a really funny question. No mentors and none at all. Not because there weren't any mentors or people didn't want to mentor me, but I've pretty much had a very resistive personality. For various reasons, I was one of those people that if somebody told me what to do or tells me to do something, I want to do the exact opposite. And it's just the way that I've been for a long time. Like I just had a lot of authority issues. And in some ways, I still do. So I just couldn't take advice. So I didn't seek advice. Also, in some ways, I felt like success wasn't meaningful if I followed a preset plan or if I got help from someone else. I don't know why I thought that or why that was in my
Mhm.
head. I think it's part of my limiting beliefs and the lack of deserving that I felt, but that's
Mhm.
what I thought. And so a part of me had this compulsion to do it on my own. Yeah, it's like in a way, it's kind of like the American mentality, like doing it my way. And so I
Yeah.
had to figure it out on my own. And it was very limiting as my learning curve was much longer than it needed to be. In fact, most of
Mhm.
my life, I was doing the opposite of what I should or what people were saying. And I mean, it made for a great adventure and great struggle and great story. But as it relates to financial success, it wasn't very helpful. And if I could give another piece of advice, I would tell people not to do what I did. It's just the wrong way to go about it. There's so much good advice out there, and there's so much we can cut down on our learning curve and our struggle if we just have somebody to show us the path and
Mhm.
to be open to listening to that person who's showing us a path and doing what they say. And what they say may not always work, but if they're a good mentor, they more often than not, it will work and it will drastically reduce the struggle that we experience in our journey of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and I see that every so often with immigrant entrepreneurs, whether they didn't have the capacity to get mentorship, but they've always wanted to because now further down their entrepreneurship journey, they think that they realize that it's so important in their successes and they think that it could have increased their successes in a lot faster
Yeah.
way than how long it took them. But there's no right path, there's no right or wrong journey. Everyone has their own entrepreneurial journey, and I'm excited to see that you figure this out all by yourself, and there are quite a few people that can operate like that, but not everyone. So
Yeah.
again, immigrant entrepreneurs, people will help if you ask. There are a wealth of resources and information that can guide us in our path. So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, can I add to that? You said there's really
Yeah.
no wrong path.
Yeah.
There is one wrong path, and
Okay.
it's resisting mentorship. It's resisting advice because some people
Mm,
just don't even think about mentorship or they don't feel like
mhm,
there's anybody around. But if there
mhm.
is somebody around and there is somebody giving you advice, don't feel the need to do it on your own. I mean, it's just kind of there's no point. It's just adding
Yeah.
unnecessary struggle. I can't tell you how many authors I've met who, paid money for a decent course to learn about how to write, publish, and market a book, or actively seek advice. And in 6 months, they have made far greater progress than I have in 6 years, only because
Wow.
they were open to the advice. And for me, just the way my mind worked for a long time, it wasn't even me deciding. It was just like my unconscious response. It was just like it very much resisted advice and it really shut out a lot of people who could have helped me. And I didn't even realize
Mm,
I was doing that. I had to come to an awareness that I had a resistant personality. And then I had to work on overcoming the resistance. So even though I realized I had a resistant personality and I was resisting good advice, I still couldn't stop it. I had to kind of like consciously, actively work on taking advice because, the way my mind worked, it made it seem like, oh, it wasn't going to work or they were just saying that to be nice or all sorts of excuses came up for why I shouldn't do or follow what someone else had said. And, like I said, it wasn't an easy journey. And people who were open-minded to seek advice, their journey was far, far less painful than mine to get to where I'm at.
mm, mm. So you think it's extremely crucial to get mentorship, networking, seeking for advice for any immigrant entrepreneur on their journey?
It is extremely crucial. In fact, there is a very successful entrepreneur who I had the fortune and pleasure to see live. His name is
Okay.
Chris Ducker. And
Okay.
he said something that just like, I mean, it's so
Stuck
obvious,
with
but
you.
yeah, it's so obvious. And I wish I'd heard it much earlier in my journey. But he said, your most important commodity next to the clock is relationships. And
Mm.
relationships can mean mentors, it can mean people who know your business and can refer your business. Like relationships and mentorship is really everything.
And I also wanted to ask you, what about marketing? Do you do any Facebook ads, Google ads, anything? And is it working?
Okay, so no Facebook or Google ads. I hear a
Okay.
lot about them, but to me, it seems like the people who succeed with Facebook and Google ads are the ones who sell courses about Facebook and Google ads. But as an author, I am using other ad platforms. Amazon
Okay.
ads is really effective because Amazon sells majority of the books, and if you're on
Hmm.
most people go to Amazon to buy books, so it's better to have an ad on Amazon because there's no intermediary step of getting them to your website or getting them into your funnel. It's just like
Hmm.
here's my book, and if you like it, you can buy it. There's also industry specific platforms like BookBub. It's focused
Okay.
strictly on books, so they have a large network of book lovers, like people who would love to read books. And then you can
Hmm.
you can run ads to advertise your book to this audience. And that's been really effective as well, knock on wood. So I think ads is really good. And I like ads because they're scalable and they work even when you're not working. So it takes time
Yeah.
to learn about ads on a specific platform and it takes time to do some testing. But once you get some successful ads going, then they just kind of generate on their own. And I could be sleeping and those ads will be running and converting for me. So that's the beauty of
Hmm.
ads. I just haven't
Hmm.
delved into Google or Facebook yet. But now that I've got the Amazon and BookBub platforms, I've got them handled. I think I'm going to start moving on to Facebook soon.
Awesome. Well, good luck with that. Let me know how that goes.
Yeah.
So, Cam, did you say that you're also doing coaching and selling online courses as well?
Yeah. So I've got my books and a lot of my sales are luckily, knock on wood, and I hope they continue to get better, are being generated through the ads, which has
Nice.
been extremely helpful because, marketing a book is very, can be time consuming. Going on
Hmm.
podcasts and doing speaking events and just getting the word out. But with ads, it's like rocket fuel. And then if you've ever done any business coaching from people, what they'll tell you is that you always want to have something else for your customers. So if your customer likes your book, what else can you offer them? So then I
Mm.
started getting into online courses and I started focusing on this area called internal resistance. It's something that doesn't get really talked about much or get much attention, but it's really affecting all of us. And it's a concept that as humans, there's a part of our mind that is designed to hold us back, is designed to keep us from growing and making progress. And you're
Hmm.
probably thinking, how could my own mind keep me from growing and progress? Well, there is this part, and I call that internal resistance. So, anytime we are faced with a decision or a course of action, that decision gets analyzed by our mind using a whole host of criterias. And if even one of the criterias is off, our mind will prevent us from acting. And
Hmm.
unless we understand what is holding us back, we could have all the motivation in the world, we can have all the knowledge, and not be able to act or make any meaningful progress. So I put together a course on that. And then through my own journey of healing and growth, I came across how I developed and I'm refining it right now, a technique that helps people overcome, some serious trauma, PTSD, and limiting parts of our past.
Hmm.
It's very accelerated healing. And I'm thinking about trying to bring this out to the world because I think there's a lot of people who have experienced some really rough childhood, especially
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, people who have experienced PTSD, veterans, even domestic violence. And once you have experienced trauma, it kind of runs your life. And traditional methods of healing aren't that effective, to be honest. Therapy can take years or decades. And I've known people who spent years of decades and really not seen major improvements. And this
Mm-hmm.
technique I've been developing, refining, has been able to get people healed within weeks, just a few sessions.
Wow.
And so that's my coaching right now. Yeah.
Congratulations on that. I'm so glad that you were able to focus on what you're good at and especially getting those talents out of you and helping others with that as well. So a
Yeah.
lot of people can go through life and, have amazing talents within them, but they don't share those talents with the world, but it will tremendously help so many others if we do reach in and have that ability to help others through our experiences and our journeys too. So, Cam, I wanted to ask you, what does the American dream mean to you?
Oh, interesting question. The American dream is kind of interesting. The American dream, when you don't live in America and or have achieved it, is the American dream. But once you have achieved it, you realize it's not all that it is cracked up to be. I mean, it is better than the alternative, especially better than where I come from. But I found that our struggles don't end. Like, I think the secret to life is not about having what you want or wanting what you
Hmm.
have, but having no wants at all. And I think once
Wow.
we, yeah, and I think we can get to that point is when we can really like open up, become free, our thinking becomes more creative than you can possibly imagine. And we're not chasing things, but just kind of enjoying.
And how do we get to that stage?
It's tough. It's tough. Re- I've been working quite a bit on it. If I may share my own experience, I've actually
Yes,
got to the
please.
point where I have been able to cut out a lot of things in my life. When it comes to food, I have gone from eating just about everything, including junk food, to cutting out pretty much all types of junk food, meats, fish, dairy,
Hmm.
gluten, even salt I've cut out of my diet. And so I eat
Hmm.
a lot of like whole organic fruits, vegetables, nuts, and pastas.
Hmm.
And that has been extremely amazing for me. Just like I just feel better.
Hmm.
I'm a lot lighter. My thinking is clear. And then I've cut out a lot of media. I haven't watched a movie in years. I mean, I haven't been to a movie theater since 2015 when I saw
Good.
the, yeah, no news and all that. I recently even stopped giving up music. And I live a fairly minimal lifestyle where I don't own a lot of things. And all of that, cutting all of that out has freed my mind. So I'm not worrying about this thing I need to own. And if I own it, worrying about taking care of it or keeping up with the Joneses or and all of that.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
kind of like being able to be comfortable in your skin and around others without needing things to validate you. And I think if we can get to that point, we can essentially have interactions and relationships with people without feeling like we need something or we need to be something or have something for people to be in our lives. And once we can get to that point, it's like we can have most any relationship or interaction. For us humans, it's really about relationships. That's how we're built.
Hmm.
We're pack animals. I know I'm kind of like going off on a tangent here, or maybe
No,
going a
you're fine.
little, but it's like just knowing that you're good enough to be around anybody. And once a mind understands that, it knows it doesn't need all these things to have people like us. And then there's no pressure to want all these things. Because at the end of the
Hmm.
day, I think a lot of our wants aren't for the thing itself, but the status that our unconscious feels it's going to give us. The opportunities for interactions and relationships it's going to bring us. You know what I'm saying?
No, I totally do, but I'm also going to be playing the devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
So hear me out. I feel like at any stage of our lives, we always want to do something more.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'd be really happy to get to a stage where I'm like completely content. I'm really cool. I really don't need to be pursuing anything else than what I already have. I think that's like maybe at retirement when you're just like kicking your feet up in the air
Yeah.
and reading books all day, not really, like wanting anything else. But even at that point, like seniors are always wanting to, pursue something greater in life. At least what I'm thinking is like at any stage of life, I'm always like, how do I better myself? How can I do better? And how do I reach more of, either success or build something for the goodness of the community? Or to me, that just seems so hard to come to it at a state where it's like, you don't really need anything. But again, I still think minimalists are still searching for something deeper on a daily basis, Kim.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I'm like, so, there was a point in my life where I traveled for 6 years, and that's when I kind of went on my 100 country journey. So
Yeah.
for nearly 6 years, I lived out of my backpack. And I'm not a
Wow.
big guy, so I had a small backpack. I had a 21-inch suitcase and your traditional school bag. And
Yeah.
that's what I owned for 6 years. So, more or less, I had enough for just clothes, toiletries, and my laptop, and
Uh-huh.
certain other things that I needed as I was, going through some extreme and tough terrain of what the world has to offer. And so I think I have gone to an extreme side of the minimalist. Yes, even though I was in that extreme end of it, I was still searching or wanting or moving towards something or searching
Yeah.
something or
Bigger
seeking something.
purpose.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But it had evolved to something completely different, completely things that could actually fulfill me versus things that seemed like were going to fulfill me, but ultimately didn't. So
Mhm.
there was
Mm.
a big important shift. It allowed me
Yeah.
to have more experiences. It allowed me to connect with nature. I've slept in the oldest rainforest in the world in Negara in Malaysia.
Wow.
I have hiked dozens of active volcanoes. I have been on the tallest mountain range in Africa. And so those experiences, there was something more I got than from the material things and the media and the food and all of that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm. I really like what you said earlier, which was we have to understand that we are enough
Yeah.
for our surroundings. We are enough as we are, as we come to this world. We are enough. And although we can be, running around in a circle looking for a bigger purpose in life or searching for something greater, we still have to come down to saying we are enough.
Yes.
And that is so simple and so powerful to
Yes.
keep that on a daily basis, but we are still enough for this world. So,
Yeah, it's extremely powerful. And if a person can get to that point, their success will go through the roof because they won't feel like they need to have this to be liked, or they need to have that to have this conversation with this business person, or they need to have this be at this level. It's like if they're enough, they can do all those things without needing all these ancillary material or whatever other stuff,
yeah.
which will allow them to take more risks. They can interact with people before they shouldn't be interacting with, and those people
Mhm.
could bring them opportunities.
Yes.
And so now they're not limiting themselves to their opportunities. And if things don't go their way, they don't feel crushed or have the weight or pressure of like fixing it because they're enough.
So, do you have a book called You Are Enough?
You know what? I feel like we need to co-write that book.
I'm telling you, Cam, you go for it. You go for it. I'll pitch in one chapter, but I think you got it. The next
Okay.
book, You Are Enough. There's so much to be said on that topic. And no,
Yeah.
I totally, absolutely love your thinking. So, Cam, I wanted to wrap up with this question. What are some things you would advise the next aspiring immigrant that wants to start their own business?
Okay. Don't let that voice in your head that says because you're an immigrant or that you're different, that you can't. That voice is false. The reason you can't is for other reasons like fear and insecurity, but not because you're an immigrant. And we all have, as immigrants, have this voice in our head that is saying, we can't do this, this won't work, we shouldn't go after this because I'm an immigrant, because I have an accent, because my skin color is different, because I don't come from this culture. And that voice is wrong. It's completely wrong.
Mhm.
Like I have learned the hard way, it was wrong and it limited me in so many ways. So the advice I would give is to just know that you are enough, more or less.
Yeah.
Like you are enough to start any business you need to. And as long as you build the relationships and the network and have some guidance and mentors under you, the sky is the limit.
I have my hands up in the air, Cam. I wish there was a video recording session here. So, can anyone reach their American dreams?
I think so. I think so. I think what limits people from reaching their American dream is that voice. And if we can start to
Yes.
realize how false that voice is, and it's not easy to ignore that voice because we might ignore it in one step of our journey, and that voice will come back in the second step and saying, okay, now this voice is definitely true. And then we have to ignore it again or figure out a way not to have it impact us. And if we can do that, then it is possible.
Thank you, Cam, so much for coming on the Immigrant Entrepreneurs podcast. Your journey is such an inspirational one, coming from India, where you grew up so poor, and to being such a successful author and an immigrant entrepreneur. It just shows all the immigrants that they can do it too. Wherever they're at right now, they are enough to start their businesses, to grow in huge capacities. And I'm so sure that this podcast has helped them tremendously and with providing immense amount of value. So thank you, Cam, for coming on the show. And I truly appreciate your time.
You're welcome very much. It was a delight. I really enjoyed being on, and I really hope people get some value from this.
Alrighty, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If there are any links that were mentioned in this episode, make sure to check them out on my website under this episode to find all the links conveniently located in the show notes. I just wanted to ask for a quick favor. If you could please leave a review wherever you're at listening to this podcast. Also, if you're an immigrant entrepreneur and would love to be on my podcast, please email me and we'll get connected. I'll see you guys all next time for another exciting and impactful episode. Take care.